Marcus Bennett had given 12 years of his life to the company. 12 years of loyalty, long nights, missed family dinners, and dedication that went unnoticed by the people who signed his paychecks. To him, work wasn't just a job. It was proof. Proof that a black man like him could rise above the stereotypes, could build something in a world that still judged him before he even opened his mouth. Every morning, Marcus arrived before the sun, holding a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to his father, a quiet symbol of pride and persistence. He greeted everyone the same, from the janitor to the executive team, even when their responses were curt or dismissive. His work ethic spoke for him, louder than words ever could. The company, Fielder and Stone Logistics, was his second home. He had started there as an entry-level analyst, a face in the background of spreadsheets and endless reports. But over the years, his skills had shown through. Marcus had become the man people came to when projects went off track, the one who could fix problems others ignored. Clients trusted him. Colleagues respected him. But those higher up, they tolerated him. It began subtly. The whispers in meetings when he spoke up, the way his ideas would be repeated, rephrased, by someone else, suddenly worthy of attention when delivered by a white colleague. He'd learned to bite his tongue, to smile through it, to play the quiet game, because he had seen what happened to those who didn't. Then came the new regional director, a man named Charles Danner. He was younger than Marcus, brash, confident, and full of the kind of arrogance that came from never having to fight for a place in the room. From the first day, Marcus could tell what kind of leader he was dealing with. Danner's compliments came wrapped in condescension. His jokes carried an edge Marcus couldn't mistake. He called Marcus one of the good ones, more than once, the kind of phrase that pretended to praise, but only reminded him of the quiet segregation still pulsing beneath the company's polished surface. At first, Marcus ignored it. He'd dealt with worse. But things began to change quickly after Danner arrived. Projects Marcus had led for years were suddenly reassigned. His name was quietly omitted from presentations. Promotions he'd been promised were reconsidered, given instead to others with less experience. Men who shared golf outings with Danner on weekends. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday morning, gray and heavy with rain. Marcus had just finished preparing a quarterly report that was supposed to secure the company's biggest client renewal yet. It had taken weeks of long nights, meticulous work, and endless revisions. When he handed it in, Danner smiled, that fake, tight smile that never reached his eyes. 2 days later, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. A company announcement, a celebration. The client deal had gone through, and the credit was given entirely to Danner. His name wasn't mentioned anywhere. Marcus stared at the screen, the words blurring. It wasn't just about recognition. It was about being erased. Again, that weekend he considered saying something. But by Monday, the decision had been made for him. He was called into HR, told his performance wasn't aligning with the company's direction, and that his position was being terminated effective immediately. No warning, no explanation that made sense. Just an envelope and a polite escort out of the building. He packed his belongings in silence. The people he'd helped for years avoided eye contact. Only the janitor, an older black man named Henry, gave him a nod as he left. A small wordless gesture of respect that said more than any of their empty goodbyes. Outside, the rain fell harder. Marcus stood there on the curb, clutching his box of personal things, watching as the building that had consumed so much of his life loomed coldly behind him. He felt hollow, not just because he'd lost his job, but because he'd been reminded, once again, that in some places, excellence wasn't enough to protect you from prejudice. Weeks turned into months. The job hunt was brutal. He sent out applications, went on interviews where he could feel the hesitation behind the recruiter's smiles, the unspoken doubt when they saw the color of his skin. "We're looking for someone who fits our culture," they'd say. He knew what that meant. Bills piled up. His savings dwindled. Friends stopped calling. And yet, somewhere in the midst of it, Marcus found a kind of clarity. Stripped of the illusion that loyalty would be rewarded, he began to think differently. If the system was never built for him, then maybe it was time to stop trying to fit inside it. He started attending community business workshops, small gatherings of people with stories like his. Immigrants, women, minorities, all trying to rebuild after being pushed aside. They shared their experiences, their failures, their anger, and their ideas. One night, Marcus stayed late after a session, staring at a blank sheet of paper, an idea forming in his mind. It was bold, risky, maybe even foolish, but it was his. A logistics company that prioritized inclusion. A firm where workers were seen and heard. Where the ones who'd been overlooked could finally lead. He called it TruePath Logistics. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He had no investors, no office, just a dream and the experience that had once been used against him. But he had something else too, resolve. What Marcus didn't know, however, was that across town, Fielder and Stone was crumbling from the inside. The very deal Danner had stolen from him was beginning to unravel, and soon karma would begin its slow, unstoppable work. But for now, Marcus was just a man at his kitchen table, sketching plans by the glow of a flickering lamp, unaware that fate was already turning in his favor. Marcus Bennett had always believed that when one door closed, another would open. But now, as he stared at the worn desk in his small apartment, covered in bills and rejection letters, he realized that sometimes you had to build the door yourself. The months following his firing were some of the hardest of his life. He woke before dawn every day, not because he had somewhere to be, but because he couldn't sleep knowing how far he'd fallen. The job that had once given his life rhythm was gone, replaced by silence and doubt. Yet beneath that silence, something was stirring, something that couldn't be silenced any longer. Marcus began studying the market he knew so well, logistics and supply chain management. He analyzed the flaws in how big companies treated their employees, how they undervalued the people doing the real work. The discrimination he'd faced had opened his eyes to a truth he could no longer ignore. Talent and hard work meant nothing in a system rigged to keep certain people down. So, he decided to change the system. With his modest severance pay and what little savings he had left, he began to build TruePath Logistics. It started small, just a name, a vision, and a rented desk in a shared workspace downtown. The office was barely larger than a closet, with second-hand furniture and a leaky air vent that rattled every time the AC kicked in. But to Marcus, it was the beginning of something real. He reached out to contacts, people he'd helped in the past who remembered his kindness and professionalism. Some were hesitant to join him at first. Others were simply afraid. Competing with giants like Fielder and Stone seemed impossible. But Marcus didn't need to conquer the industry overnight. He just needed to start. He built his team from the ground up, a group of overlooked workers, minorities, and dreamers who had all faced some form of discrimination. Each one brought a story, a scar, and a fire that matched his own. Together, they shared a single mission to prove that integrity could still win in a world that rewarded greed. The early days were brutal. Marcus worked 18-hour shifts, juggling clients, managing trucks, doing paperwork by hand, and even driving deliveries himself. He spent nights sleeping at his desk, the hum of his old computer the only sound in the dark. But slowly, things began to shift. One small client led to another. Then a local business gave them a chance after hearing about their mission. TruePath began earning a reputation, not just for reliability, but for fairness. Marcus insisted that every driver was paid on time, that every worker was treated with dignity. Meanwhile, across the city, Fielder and Stone was thriving, or so it appeared. Danner strutted through the marble halls like a king, his arrogance growing with every headline praising his leadership. But beneath the surface, the foundation was beginning to crack. The deal he had stolen, Marcus's deal, was unraveling. The client had begun noticing discrepancies in the reports, delays in shipments, and missing invoices. Without Marcus's meticulous management, Danner's shortcuts were catching up to him. Rumors started to circulate about financial mismanagement, about employees leaving in droves. HR complaints piled up, ignored by the same people who had once turned a blind eye to Marcus's mistreatment. Marcus heard about it through old colleagues who still respected him. They reached out quietly, saying they missed his leadership, his fairness, his calm. Some even asked if TruePath had openings. Within a year, Marcus's small company began growing faster than anyone could have predicted. He secured a partnership with a regional chain, a contract that would put TruePath on the map. He hired more workers, upgraded his office, and bought his first fleet of branded trucks, white with the bold blue letters TRS Logistikzars built on trust. Still, he carried his past with him. The memory of that final day at Fielder and Stone, the humiliation, the dismissal, stayed fresh in his mind. He had no desire for revenge, not yet. His focus was survival, growth, and proof that he could succeed without them. But fate had its own timing. One afternoon, while reviewing new client requests, Marcus froze. The company name on the proposal form glared up at him: Fielder and Stone Logistics. They wanted TruePath to partner with them as a subcontractor. It didn't make sense at first. Why would a corporate giant reach out to a small, independent competitor? But as he read further, the truth became clear. Fielder and Stone had lost several key accounts. They were struggling to keep up with demand. Danner had overpromised, underdelivered, and now the company was desperate for help. The request came with an attached note from one of the executives. It wasn't from Danner, but from the board of directors themselves. They wanted to explore collaboration opportunities with TruePath. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his heartbeat steady but strong. The same company that had fired him without cause, the same one that had treated him like he didn't belong, was now knocking on his door. It wasn't karma yet, but it was the first whisper of it. That night, as he closed his office, Marcus stood at the window watching the city lights flicker below. He thought of how far he'd come, not just in business, but as a man. He had built something from nothing, something they could no longer ignore. The past still haunted him, but now it no longer defined him. It fueled him. Still, part of him couldn't help but wonder. What would he do when they came face to face again? When the people who had cast him out realized that the man they'd underestimated had built something stronger than they ever could. He didn't know the answer yet, but he would soon, because the next email that landed in his inbox wasn't from the board. It was from a recruitment firm. They were searching for a new CEO for Fielder and Stone, and Marcus Bennett's name had been recommended. The email sat unopened in Marcus's inbox for nearly an hour. He stared at the subject line: Executive Leadership Opportunity, Fielder and Stone Logistics, as if it were a ghost from his past. Every part of him wanted to delete it, to pretend it didn't exist. Yet he couldn't look away. Curiosity eventually overpowered hesitation. When he finally opened it, the message was brief but shocking. The recruitment agency explained that Fielder and Stone's board was conducting a quiet search for a new CEO after a series of internal performance concerns. Someone, whose name was conveniently withheld, had recommended Marcus as a strategic, visionary leader with deep industry insight. At first, Marcus laughed under his breath. Was this some cruel joke? The same company that had humiliated him, forced him to rebuild his life from ashes, was now inviting him to sit in the same chair as the man who had called him unfit. But the more he read, the clearer it became that this wasn't a joke. The company was in trouble, bad trouble. Stocks had plummeted. Clients had withdrawn contracts. Whispers of unethical practices and discrimination scandals had reached investors. The board was desperate to save what was left. Still, Marcus didn't respond immediately. He needed time, not to decide if he should go, but how. Because now, for the first time, he held the power. He met with his closest advisor, Iva, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had stood by him from the beginning of TruePath. Together, they reviewed every detail of Fielder and Stone's decline. Reports of lawsuits, anonymous employee complaints, lost accounts that eerily matched TruePath's growing clientele. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The empire that once thrived on exclusion was collapsing under the weight of its arrogance. Marcus knew he could fix it. He also knew he didn't have to. But something inside him, deeper than ambition, deeper than pride, wanted to walk through those doors again. Not as a victim, not as a former employee, but as the one person they could no longer deny. After a week, he replied to the email. The meeting was scheduled. When he arrived at the boardroom, the contrast hit him like a wave. The marble floors gleamed just as they always had, the receptionists greeted visitors with polite smiles, and the company logo still shimmered above the entrance. But the energy was different, colder, emptier. Inside the conference room sat 6 board members, each with wary eyes and tight smiles. The seat at the head of the table, once occupied by Danner, was conspicuously empty. The meeting was formal, measured. They asked questions about leadership philosophy, restructuring, and brand rehabilitation. Marcus answered with calm authority, weaving his experience at TruePath into every response. He didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He simply let the truth speak for itself. He told them about building a logistics company from scratch, one rooted in transparency, equality, and trust. He spoke about second chances and accountability, about what it meant to lead with integrity. By the time the interview ended, he could see it in their eyes. They weren't just impressed. They were relieved. They needed someone like him to clean up the mess left behind by years of corruption and ego. The offer came 2 days later. Marcus Bennett was officially named the new CEO of Fielder and Stone Logistics. News of his appointment spread like wildfire. Industry insiders were stunned. Employees whispered in disbelief. Some of his former co-workers, the same ones who had watched him escorted out of the building years ago, now stood frozen as he walked through those same glass doors again, this time with security at his side not to remove him, but to protect him. And somewhere in that building, a man named Charles Danner sat alone in his office, still clinging to his title, unaware that his reign was over. The board had yet to announce the transition publicly. Marcus would shadow the company for a month before officially assuming full control. It was a professional courtesy, but also, in Marcus's mind, poetic justice. He spent that first week quietly observing. He attended meetings, reviewed files, and met department heads. Many avoided eye contact. Others tried to flatter him, pretending they had always respected him. Marcus didn't respond. He remembered their faces, those who had mocked his suggestions, those who had smirked when Danner belittled him. And then came the day he had been waiting for. He was scheduled to meet with Danner. It was a formal, transition meeting, meant to ensure a smooth handover. But for Marcus, it was far more than that. It was the moment the tables turned. He entered Danner's office and found the man visibly thinner, grayer, and more anxious than he remembered. Time and failure had carved deep lines into his once confident face. On the desk lay scattered reports, unpaid invoices, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Marcus greeted him with calm professionalism. Danner forced a smile, clearly struggling to hide his discomfort. He extended his hand, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked, one filled with arrogance, trying to remember confidence, the other steady with quiet power. Marcus said nothing about the past. He didn't need to. His very presence spoke louder than any words could. For the next hour, they went over documents, projections, and transition notes. Danner's voice trembled when he tried to explain the company's decline, blaming unforeseen market changes and staff inefficiencies. Marcus knew the truth. It wasn't the market. It was Danner's pride, his prejudice, his inability to value the people who made the company great. By the end of the meeting, Danner could no longer hide his frustration. His mask slipped. He muttered something about ungrateful people and diversity quotas ruining the industry. Marcus simply closed his folder, looked up, and gave a faint, knowing smile. That was all it took. Danner froze, realizing that the man he had once dismissed as unfit was now his successor, and soon his superior. The official announcement came 2 weeks later. The press release was everywhere. Fielder and Stone welcomes new CEO Marcus Bennett, a visionary leader committed to change. The image of Marcus shaking hands with the board chairman dominated every business outlet. When Danner read it, his glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor. Marcus didn't celebrate publicly. But that night, as he sat in his office, he allowed himself one quiet moment of satisfaction. Not vengeance, but justice. Still, his work wasn't done. The company was rotting from within, riddled with inequality, resentment, and fear. If he truly wanted to honor his journey, he couldn't just replace the face at the top. He had to rebuild the heart of the company itself. And that was where the real revenge, the poetic kind, would begin. Because Marcus Bennett didn't just want to run Fielder and Stone. He wanted to transform it, and soon, every single person who had doubted him would see exactly what a man they once called unfit could build when given the power they'd tried to take away. The first day Marcus officially took charge as CEO felt surreal. The same corridors that once echoed with whispered mockery now carried only silence as he walked through. Employees avoided his gaze, unsure whether to greet him or pretend not to notice. The tension in the air was thick, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. But Marcus wasn't there to make a scene. He was there to rebuild and to expose. In his first week, he ordered a comprehensive audit of every department. Financials, HR policies, hiring records, internal complaints. Nothing was off limits. It wasn't about revenge. It was about uncovering truth. He knew the company's culture had been poisoned long before he left. Now, he needed to see just how deep the infection ran. What he found was worse than he imagined. The HR department had buried dozens of discrimination reports. Black, Latino, and immigrant employees were consistently underpaid compared to their white counterparts. Promotions were handed out through favoritism, not merit. A toxic chain of command had been carefully maintained under Danner's leadership, rewarding obedience and punishing anyone who questioned authority. Emails surfaced, condescending jokes, coded language, just business talk, masking outright racism. There were bonuses for managers who proved the company image, which in reality meant replacing unfit employees with those who looked the part. Marcus read every document carefully, sometimes forcing himself to stop when anger burned too hot to control. He had lived this culture firsthand. But seeing it written systemic, organized was another wound entirely. He didn't confront anyone immediately. Instead, he began making quiet, deliberate moves. He called closed-door meetings with department heads, not to scold but to observe. He listened to how they spoke, how they justified decisions, how they squirmed when certain topics arose. Within weeks, he had a clear picture of who was complicit and who had simply been surviving. Some were guilty of outright discrimination. Others were victims of a system too fearful to speak. Then came the restructuring. He started by dissolving the old HR leadership. The same people who had once ignored complaints now found themselves escorted out by security. Next were the department managers who had maintained discriminatory practices. Every dismissal was by the book, justified, documented, irrefutable. But to those watching, it was something deeper. Karma. At the same time, Marcus reached out to employees who had once been silenced. He reinstated several who had been unfairly terminated under Danner's rule. He made a public commitment to diversity not as a PR stunt, but as a foundation. Soon, the company began to feel different. The mood in the offices shifted, cautious optimism replacing quiet fear. People who had once walked with their heads down began to smile again. Teams started collaborating rather than competing. But not everyone welcomed the change. A small group of executives loyal to Danner resisted Marcus's reforms. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning his leadership. Some leaked false stories to the press, suggesting he was too radical, too emotional, too focused on race. Marcus expected this, and he was prepared. He had one final piece of leverage, a file he hadn't yet revealed. During the audit, his legal team discovered several questionable transactions between Danner and a private contractor. Payments labeled as consulting fees were traced to shell companies owned by Danner's associates. The evidence was damning. Marcus could have gone straight to the authorities, but he wanted Danner to see it first. He arranged a private meeting with the former CEO, now unemployed and living off his savings. When Danner entered the office, his arrogance was gone. He looked defeated, desperate. Marcus handed him the file and watched the color drain from his face as he read. Every number, every transaction, every forged signature. It was all there, proof of corruption, proof of the hypocrisy that had fueled his reign. Marcus didn't need to say a word. Danner understood what this meant. His legacy was gone, his reputation destroyed. Whatever illusions of superiority he had clung to were shattered. When Danner left the building that day, he was a ghost of the man he had once been. The whispers of his downfall spread quickly, not by Marcus's doing, but through the natural course of poetic justice. And Marcus, he didn't gloat, he didn't celebrate, he simply returned to his office and continued his work. Because this victory wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoration. Under his leadership, Fielder and Stone began to thrive again. New partnerships formed, old clients returned. The company's image transformed from exclusion to empowerment. People no longer feared the upper floors. They aspired to reach them. But amid all the rebuilding, Marcus never forgot what it felt like to lose everything. He carried that memory as his compass, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he did. Then, one day, a letter arrived on his desk. It bore no return address, just a single line inside. Thank you for proving them wrong. It was signed by a name he didn't recognize, but he didn't need to. He knew it came from someone whose life, like his, had been changed by the new culture he was creating. That simple note reminded him that his revenge had already served its purpose. But life, as he was about to learn, had one final test waiting. One that would force him to choose between justice and forgiveness. Because while Marcus had rebuilt his professional world, the emotional scars of the past had never fully healed. And soon, something, or someone, would return to confront him with the question he had avoided for years. Could he truly forgive the man who took everything from him? Months passed, and under Marcus's leadership, Fielder and Stone flourished in ways no one had imagined possible. The company that once symbolized elitism and exclusion was now being hailed as a model of diversity and ethical leadership. Media outlets wrote stories about its transformation. Investors returned, and employees found pride in their work again. For Marcus, every headline was both vindication and responsibility. He had not only reclaimed his dignity but redefined what leadership meant. Yet, beneath the accolades, there was still an emptiness. A quiet, unspoken ache that success couldn't soothe. It wasn't about the job anymore. It was about closure. And closure, as fate would have it, came knocking sooner than expected. One rainy afternoon, his assistant entered his office holding a brown envelope. Inside was a short message and a photocopy of a police report. The words made Marcus's heart sink. Charles Danner, former CEO of Fielder and Stone, arrested for fraud and embezzlement. Marcus sat still, reading the report over and over. The numbers matched those in the file he'd given Danner months earlier. It seemed the authorities had finally acted on it, perhaps after Danner's creditors or business partners had come forward. Either way, the fall was complete. For years, Danner had lived off the remnants of his wealth, still believing he could claw his way back into respectability. Now, his name was synonymous with disgrace. The same newspapers that once praised him as a visionary leader now branded him a corporate criminal. The poetic justice was undeniable. Marcus had achieved what most could only dream of: redemption through truth, victory through integrity. But something about it felt hollow. He had expected satisfaction. Instead, he felt pity. Weeks later, he received another letter, handwritten and trembling. It was from Danner's wife. She explained that Charles had suffered a severe heart attack in custody. He had been released on medical grounds but was in critical condition at a public hospital. There was one more line, almost desperate in tone. He asked for you. Marcus read the words again, unsure if he'd seen them correctly. Danner, the man who had once humiliated him, called him unfit, stripped him of his livelihood, wanted to see him. For days, Marcus wrestled with the decision. Every rational part of him said to ignore it. Danner had made his choices. He had reaped the consequences. Why should Marcus offer compassion to someone who had never shown him any? And yet, deep within, another part of him, the one that remembered what it felt like to be broken, unseen, cast aside, whispered differently. So one evening after work, Marcus drove to the hospital. The rain hadn't stopped. It fell against the windshield like the world was trying to wash away its own sins. The building was old, dimly lit, and quiet. He found the room easily. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant and silence. Charles Danner lay in the bed, frail, pale, a shadow of the man who had once strutted through boardrooms with power dripping from every word. Tubes ran from his arms, machines beeped softly at his bedside. When his eyes flickered open, he barely recognized Marcus. There were no words spoken, none were needed. The silence between them carried years of history, of injustice, humiliation, downfall, and now fragility. Danner reached weakly toward the bedside table. His trembling hand pushed forward a folded piece of paper. Marcus hesitated, then took it. Inside was a faded photo, the old Fielder and Stone headquarters, and beneath it a handwritten note. You were right, that was all. Danner's eyes closed again, and Marcus stood motionless for what felt like hours. He had imagined this moment so many times, how he would confront him, how he would make him answer for everything. But standing there, seeing the man powerless, remorseful, and near death, Marcus felt no victory. Only the quiet weight of forgiveness waiting to be chosen. He left the hospital without another word. That night, he sat in his office long after everyone had gone home. The city lights reflected on the glass windows, and for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to weep, not for loss, not for anger, but for release. Because forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about letting someone else off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from their shadow. Over the next few days, news spread that Danner had passed away. The company that once bore his name was now under Marcus's stewardship, thriving, ethical, renewed. Some employees spoke of Danner with anger, others with pity, but Marcus said nothing. He had made peace privately, and that was enough. Then, a week later, something unexpected arrived. It was a legal document, Danner's final will. Despite his public disgrace, he had left one specific request: a scholarship fund to be established in Marcus Bennett's name to support minority students pursuing careers in business and leadership. The irony was staggering. The man who had once tried to keep Marcus from climbing the ladder had, in the end, built a foundation to lift others like him. Marcus honored the request. He expanded it, matching the donation with his own contribution. The Bennett Danner Leadership Fund became one of the company's proudest initiatives, a living testament to both accountability and grace. As he stood at the scholarship's launch event, Marcus looked out at the young faces in the crowd, students from every background, full of potential and hope. He realized that his revenge had evolved into something greater transformation. The story that began with loss and humiliation had ended with renewal and purpose. But there was still one final moment left, a symbolic act that would close the circle completely. A week later, Marcus returned to his old hometown, to the modest neighborhood where his mother had once worked double shifts to support him. Standing in front of the small house, he felt everything he'd endured. The pain, the humiliation, the resilience, come full circle. He placed the folded photograph Danner had given him into a small time capsule beneath a tree in the yard. On the back of the photo, he wrote a single sentence: "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it." Then he walked a lighter, freer, and finally whole. Years passed, and time transformed Marcus Bennett from a man driven by vengeance into one guided by purpose. What began as a journey to reclaim dignity had grown into something far greater, a legacy that touched countless lives. Under his leadership, Fielder and Stone Logistics evolved into one of the most respected companies in the nation. But more importantly, it became a symbol, proof that justice and compassion could coexist in the same story. Its once toxic halls now echoed with laughter, collaboration, and hope. The Bennett Danner Leadership Fund blossomed beyond all expectations. What started as a small scholarship initiative soon expanded into a full-fledged mentorship program, helping underprivileged students find opportunities in business, technology, and leadership. Many of those students, young, bright, and diverse, would later return to the company as employees, carrying forward the culture Marcus had built. He often watched them from his office window, the interns, the young managers, the dreamers, and saw versions of his younger self in each of them. They were fearless, unapologetic, and proud of who they were. No one told them to hide their identity, to straighten their hair, to fit in. They belonged. And that, more than any profit margin or corporate award, was his greatest victory. Still, Marcus never let success numb his awareness. He knew prejudice didn't disappear. It adapted, resurfacing in new forms, subtle and insidious. That's why he used his platform to speak out. He gave lectures at universities, delivered keynote speeches about diversity and leadership, and mentored rising executives who once thought the boardroom wasn't meant for them. Everywhere he went, people remembered his story, not as a tale of revenge, but of redemption. He was often asked what had driven him to forgive Charles Danner in the end. His answer was always the same: because holding on to hate doesn't change the world. Building something better does. In time, his message reached far beyond business. Communities adopted his principles for local programs. Schools taught his story as a case study in ethics and leadership. Even those who had once doubted him found themselves inspired by his grace. But for Marcus, the most meaningful change wasn't in public perception. It was personal. One afternoon, he returned to the same small park where he used to sit years ago, unemployed and broken after being fired. The bench was still there, weathered by time but sturdy as ever. He sat down, closed his eyes, and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. He remembered that day, how hopeless he had felt, how lost. He remembered the shame, the anger, the helplessness of knowing he had been judged not by his skill, but by his skin. Yet now, sitting in the same spot, he understood something profound. That pain had been necessary. It was the fire that had forged his strength, the wound that had birthed his purpose. Without it, he would never have found his voice. In the distance, a small group of children played near the fountain. Their laughter carried through the air, carefree, untainted by the divisions that once defined so many lives. Among them was a boy with skin the color of his own and a girl with eyes bright and curious. They played together without hesitation, without prejudice. It was a sight that filled Marcus with quiet joy, because it was a glimpse of the future he had fought for, a future where race was not a barrier, but a part of a shared human story. Later that evening, he returned home and opened a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were letters, ones he had written but never sent, addressed to people from his past, his mother, his younger self, and one to Charles Danner. He read them one last time, then placed the notebook in a drawer. It was time to let it rest. The following year, Marcus announced his retirement. The news spread across the business world, drawing tributes and accolades from peers and politicians alike. When asked what he planned to do next, he simply smiled and said, "To give back what I was once denied, opportunity." In his farewell address, he stood before hundreds of employees, people from every background, every color, every story, and looked out across the sea of faces. His voice was calm but carried the weight of a man who had lived every word. He spoke about the value of empathy, about choosing integrity over ambition, and about remembering that true leadership is not about power, but service. And before leaving the stage, he said something that would be quoted for years to come. "The world will never be perfect, but every act of fairness makes it better, and every person who chooses justice over comfort becomes a light that outlives them." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the audience rose, not just to applaud, but to honor him. In the months that followed, Marcus traveled, wrote, and taught. He spent more time with his family, finally allowing himself to rest. Yet wherever he went, his influence lingered, in boardrooms that now valued diversity, in classrooms that taught inclusion, in communities that believed in second chances. And somewhere, beneath the old oak tree in his mother's yard, the time capsule he buried still slept, a quiet witness to a life that had come full circle. Years later, when the neighborhood children dug it up by accident, they found the photo inside, faded but legible. On the back were still the words he had written long ago. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it." The children didn't fully understand its meaning, but their parents did. And so the story of Marcus Bennett lived on, not as a tale of revenge, but as a testament to resilience, grace, and the unshakable truth that no act of prejudice can extinguish a heart determined to rise. Because in the end, karma hadn't just punished those who wronged him. It had rewarded the one who refused to become like them. And that was the greatest justice of all.